Epilogue. He'd never liked the rookery. It was a purely personal dislike, Captain Ocean Tredegar would admit if pressed. He had spent half a year down in the lanes after enlisting, becoming fit for deployment, and though that had been a foul time, it was also long enough ago he hardly remembered. His antipathy nowadays came from the fact that since he'd been inducted into the Unearthly Society he had only ever returned to the rookery for a fresh squabble over funds with conclave bureaucrats. The worst part was, of course, that these squabbles were largely meaningless. The conclave's army of clerks and bookkeepers could not actually make any decision, only pass recommendations to the conclave itself, which would then proceed to make no decision at all, because it did not directly allocate funding to the works of the Clockwork Cathedral, whose continued funding Ocean was sent to argue for. The conclave, in practice, did not actually decide much of anything. At the founding of the watch the chamber had been small enough to be functional, but over the years the assembly had simply become so large it was not practical for it to decide on anything but the broadest strokes of policy. Execution of those policies was then passed on to committees who ended up wielding the power the conclave had invested in them with varying degrees of oversight. There was some truth to the complaints from the captain generals that some garrison regions were essentially rival-free companies funded by conclave coin. But fair or not, it was committees that ran the watch, and it was such a committee that had ordered Ocean Tredegar to sit in a cold damp hall and wait for his name to be called. There had been 10 of them out here when he'd arrived, but one by one the other rooks had gone into the small room tucked away in a forgotten corner of the old tree. And one by one they had left, until there remained only him and the monster. She looked like a frail old woman, but Ocean knew better. Fenhua had sent him word last night, warned him that he was looking not as some retired cloak but fucking name eater. The worst part was that he would never have guessed if he'd not been warned. Even now he almost doubted himself, looking at how she seemed to ache from the wet cold and shiver in her shawl. There were some who said that creature was older than the Republic's, that she had fought in the last assault on Pandemonium. Neray glanced at him, as if sniffing out his thoughts, and offered a warm toothless smile. Ancestors, but she looked like someone's favorite grandmother. "I'm sure it will be soon, dear," the name eater assured him in a faint Sacramonte accent. "There is no need to be so tense, I am certain your niece will be fine." Ocean stiffened, for he had never spoken a word to Neray, and he'd certainly never said anything about Angie around that monster. His hand habitually drifted to where his pistol would be, had he not been ordered to leave it behind at the old tree's gates. "Oh, no need for that," Neray chided him. "Such a lovely girl, your Angharade. I'm sure she will be a darling friend to my Tristan. And a mirror dancer, how precious. They rarely leave Peretter nowadays." "I am not without friends," Ocean coldly replied. His work on the Azabanqua had put him firmly on the good side of his superiors. They had already done him favors, but he should be able to squeeze out a few more. "Or debts, of late," Neray said, tapping her wrinkled chin. That was most amusing to hear. To think it took the Wednesday Council itself to curb your enthusiasm. Ocean grit his teeth. The ruling council of the Unearthly Society had not officially spoken with him at all. Professor Akia had sat him down in private so there would be no mark on his record, but the name eater was a mask, and that breed always made a point of rubbing your secrets in your face when they could. Not that he would let himself. The door opened, the same middle-aged watchman as always leaning through. "Captain Ocean, Officer Neray," he called out. "The committee will see you now." Ocean bit down on his words, trying to smooth the anger off his face. "Come, dear," Neray warmly said. "Let us find out what it is the obscure committee has to say." Breathing out, Ocean Tredegar forced himself to calm down. The monster had just been toying with him the way a cat would with a mouse. She had no true interest in Angharade, he told himself as he followed behind the thing wearing the form of a little old woman. He must keep his mind on the obscure committee waiting ahead. Not that it was truly called that, at least on paper. Its formal name on the rolls was Lesser Committee for the Trebian Northwest, the kind of name that got made fun of at parties when officers mocked conclave bureaucracy over cups of wine. It was an oft-forgotten detail, however, that the ruins of Shola Manse lay in the northwest of the Trebian Sea. Though a lesser committee would naturally not have authority over the greater committee overseeing the same region, its existence as an independent entity meant it was not subject to that greater committee's authority either. In practice, that meant Shalomance and all matters connected to it had been made the private fiefdom of the 4 people Ocean found waiting inside the small, cramped room. That alone would have been worth wariness, but altogether more dangerous was that this authority had apparently been granted to them by a sealed vote of the conclave, meaning the matter was kept secret. The obscure committee was called that because more than 9/10 of the watch would have absolutely no idea it existed, even though it now held great power and influence. There were 4 high desks inside the room, covered with stacks of paper and inkwells, and the 4 members of the committee sat behind them. The watchman from earlier closed the door, leaning back against it, and Neray trudged forward to stand before the desks. Ocean followed, moving to her right but putting enough space between them he would have been able to draw and fire his pistol in time, if he still had it. The gesture did not escape the attention of the leftmost sitter, who raised an eyebrow at him. Brigadier Angela Arty was a middle-aged woman of plain looks, her wavy brown hair going down to her neck. She was built like a barn door, broad-shouldered and muscled enough to wrestle a bull, and by the looks of the scar around her neck someone had once tried to hang her. Most importantly, Angela Arty was an academician, a stripe. The academy was the largest of the 7 covenants, about as large as all the others put together, so its claiming one of the committee seats had never been in doubt. There was another edge to that blade, however. Competition within academy ranks for the appointment would have been brutal. That meant Brigadier Arty was as much a political creature as a military one, for all that she looked like she should be leading some charge in the Bleaklands instead of sitting at a table. And by the disgusted look she sent the monster at Ocean's side, she was no fonder of the creature than he. "Officer Neray," Brigadier Arty said, her voice sounding like she gurgled rocks, "this is revolting. You look like someone's grandmother." Neray smiled. "Where lies the trouble, dear?" The brigadier shivered. "I saw you eat a man's entrails with my own eyes, back in '73, Arty flatly replied. "Head right in the belly, like a pig with a trough. Put on a shape that I won't want to shoot." The old creature cocked her head to the side, noticeably not moving to obey. Ocean had no idea if by right she should, and neither would most in the room. Officer was the placeholder rank that the Cryptia used when they were not assigned to a duty and thus not forced to reveal their actual rank to the watchmen around them. Angela Arty might be a sitter on the obscure committee, but if Neray was of higher rank she would not actually need to obey her. Only one person in the room was likely to know, and all eyes went to him. At the rightmost desk sat Lord Asher of the Cryptia. He looked like a handsome man in his 50s. His short salt and pepper beard lending him a distinguished air. His clothes were perfectly tailored, their buttons gold, and if not for the polished cane in his hand Ocean would have never guessed he had a limp. Lord Asher also wore spectacles, which he never took off because no matter how well a devil took care of the shell they wore the eyes tended to look a little off after a century. Ocean made sure not to look at the rings on his hand or the charming smile on his face. There was no telling if the rumors that Lord Asher was a founding member of the Cryptia were true, but there were records of the man going back centuries, and when devils got that old they grew warped. The young ones, fresh out of the forges and pandemonium, they just wanted tainted ether of any kind. The old ones who annealed grew discerning and addicted to particularities, specific tastes. First love, fear of water, paternal pride, any of the endless corners of mankind's soul. No one knew what Lord Asher was addicted to, but most figured it was secrets. He had certainly been in the Cryptia long enough to get his hands on a trove fit to topple an empire. As for the devil's own rank, well, who knew? The masks never gave that kind of information first, and even then sometimes lied. "Let us be courteous, Neray," Lord Asher warmly smiled. "Change for the brigadier." The old woman laughed, and after a heartbeat she fluttered. There was no other word for it, as if she had for an instant become made of 100,000 slices of paper moving with the wind. When the blur passed the old Sacramentan woman was instead a small Someshwari boy clutching at his 2 large clothes, sending a gap-toothed grin up at the stripe. He could not have been older than 5. Angela Ari went red with rage, fumbling for a pistol under her desk. "Change right now," she hissed. "Do you want to shoot me now, Brigadier?" Naray asked. The cutesy tone, just like a little boy's, made Ocean's skin crawl. It was like looking at a crocodile wearing a person's face. "Asher," the Brigadier snarled, turning to the devil, "this is a threat. She can't just wear my grandson's face and, perhaps," Lord Asher politely smiled, "next time you will remember to be more careful with your phrasing, and you. Always a lesson worth learning, no matter one's age." The Brigadier was livid and likely to press the matter, Ocean judged, but it would not get to that. The sitter next to her cleared her throat. The sound was irritated. "This is not the Academy, La'ari," Captain Isaac Falade said. "Your whims are not orders, and we have wasted enough time indulging your sensibilities." The committee seat the Guildhouse had got its hands on had been filled by an Akiller rather than a Skiritai, which was no surprise. The militants had well earned their reputation for general awfulness at watch politics, in part because of the high attrition rate and even in their most senior officer ranks. The Navigators, on the other hand, were arguably the oldest of the Seven Covenants, and they were everywhere. They always had favors to call on, and they were more than willing to cover for the Skiritai if they got to speak for both of the Guildhouse's guilds in exchange. The representative on the committee was Captain Isaac Falade, a seemingly frail old woman in her 70s wearing humble grey robes. Her head was nearly shaved and she looked half-blind, pale cataracts in both her eyes, but she was always smiling and cocking her head to the side as if she could hear things no one else did. Given that she was rumored to be one of the most skilled signifiers alive, that was entirely possible. Despite the seemingly low rank, Isaac Falade had in her time served as Captain General to the infamous Dawn Chasers and survived a decade attached to the court of the High Queen. Long before Rhiannon's time, so Ocean's sister never knew her, but no one survived at the feet of the Queen Perpetual without learning how to get their hands dirty. A good thing, that. Angharade was headed for the Skiritai Guild, so Captain Falade would be on his side for the coming review. That and he had bribed her personally, as well as the Skiritai who'd recommended his niece. It always paid to be sure, usually in gold. Ocean's eyes moved to his other ally in the room, seated beside the signifier. Professor Fenhu. He was peeling society, not a Muthi like him, but the college always stuck together against outsiders, especially around budget time. Fenhua was a tall and willowy beauty, their long dark hair flowing behind their back as they offered a sunny smile. Their robes were pristine silk in the traditional Jigong fashion, with billowing sleeves and discreet touches of color, every part of them meticulously neat. Fenhua's specialty was epistemological foundationals, attempting to establish objective truths about the other, and that was as much of an opposite from Ocean's work in the Clockwork Cathedral as one could find, but they got on well regardless. Sharing a war room during the hunt for the Hullbreaker had left them with some ties of friendship, and it had most who took part in those months of horror. Fenhua caught his eye and winked, forcing Ocean to swallow a grin. Yeah, Fenhua had his back. If Officer Naray causes such unseemly emotion in our colleague, let us finish our business with her as quickly as possible, the professor said. Shall we move to review the candidature of Tristan Abraskal, Sholoman's candidate under Cryptia sponsorship? Ocean cleared his throat. Captain Ocean, Lord Asher acknowledged him. You have a question? Sir, Ocean nodded. May I ask why I am to be in the room when this Tristan Abraskal is to be reviewed? He and your niece will be joining the same Sholoman's cabal, should the reviews end positively, the devil amiably said. It was judged unnecessary for the questionings to be kept separate. Ocean's lips thinned, but he nodded. Though he misliked the possibility of some Sacramonti rot dragging down Angie with him, he would gain nothing by arguing a decision that would have required a majority vote to pass. If that is all, let us proceed, Captain Falade sleepily said. We have all read the reports from Lieutenant Wen and Sergeant Mandissa as well as the transcripts from the observers manning the panopticon mirrors. The boy effectively led the crew that collapsed the Red Eyes prison in the mountain with it, though it was not his hand that did the actual deed. A heartbeat of silence, then the assessments began. He should be shot, Brigadier La'ari plainly said. He buried 2 watch fortresses, led to the deaths of dozens of our rooks, and broke a seal we have no real replacement for. A bullet to the brains is the least of what he deserves." Lord Asher smiled. "There we must disagree," he said. "As far as I am concerned, Tristan Abraskell is the only individual to have ever passed the trial of ruins. If I could, I would amend every preceding file on record as having retroactively failed." "Fucking sneaks," Brigadier La'ari sneered. You are boring me, and you," Professor Fenhu sighed. "All acts undertaken in the trials that do not break the rules qualify for amnesty, as you well know. Stop wasting our time on a tantrum." They leaned forward after, eyeing Nere curiously. "You have it in your written recommendation that your little maskling was likely involved with forbidden experiments classified under the name Theogony," Fenhu said. "Elaborate." "I would know if he is a potential danger to fellow students." Ocean hid his amusement. "A transparent phishing attempt, not that they were likely to be called on it." Nere beamed up at Lord Asher, looking for permission. The monster looked like a child playing in their parents' clothes, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. "Spirits, but it was obscene." Lord Asher nodded. "House Cherden ran a red shop out in the murk," Nere brightly said, "contracting with the local cocoa coteries for a supply of fresh bodies and running experiments that were in breach of the Iscariot Accords." The shape of the 5-year-old preened, as if the child was proud of having said all those difficult words without tripping. "To what aim?" Professor Fenhua asked. It was not Nere that answered, this time. "We are yet uncertain," Lord Asher said, sounding ever so slightly irritated. "Like every other fool out there, they tried to make a stable saint, but they also attempted some exotic contract accommodations." He paused, sending the Tianxi a knowing look through his spectacles. "They used forceful ether taint as a base for their research," the mask noted. "Nothing you would be interested in." The devil spoke true, all trace of interest leaving Fenhua's eyes as Ocean swallowed bile. Forceful ether taint was a pretty way of saying torture, most of the time. All humans not severed from the glare tainted the ether around them by their very existence, but most of those emanations were so faint they could barely be proved to exist, much less studied. Sharp emotions and sensations were a way to make that taint stronger, and nothing was easier to inflict than pain. "We had them, but they closed their lair and ran away," Nere pouted. "The Cherden set up shop on some secret island, but we can't seem to find their clubhouse." "They likely have help from one of the 6, Lord Asher said. "We are pursuing the matter." "Interesting, but ultimately irrelevant," Captain Falade said. "Our purpose is to ascertain whether or not the boy's place in Shalomance should be rescinded. Despite Brigadier La'ari's bluster, I see no valid reason for that to be the case." "Neither do I," Professor Fenhu said. "Asher, shall we assume your vote?" "Never," the devil seriously said. "I also vote against rescinding." Brigadier La'ari grunted in displeasure but argued no further after casting her vote for. She could tell a losing battle when she was fighting one. "You'll all be singing a different song in a few years when we are putting down the red eye for the 18th time, and we can't send anyone to a firing squad to answer for the costs and casualties," she warned. Ocean let out a noise of interest, catching their attention. "I heard the Dominion was sitting atop an old god, but I thought it dead from the disaster with the mountain. It survived to fragment?" he asked. "Our signifiers have ascertained we are dealing with at least a dozen shards capable of agency," Captain Falade said. "Pandemonium's last surprise killed the central intellect. At a guess the fragments will be spending the next 20 years cannibalizing each other in an attempt to reform it." "The devils laid a skillful trap," Professor Fenhu noted, then their tone turned teasing. "Why, it might even have been the work of—" There was a creaking sound, the wood of Lord Asher's cane giving under his grip. "The Office of Opposition. Those devils that served as Hell's answer to the Cryptia," Ocean recalled, though it seemed from Asher's smiling anger that there might be old history there he knew not. "It was not," the old devil said, tone clipped. "If you say so," Professor Fenhu said, smiling like someone who had just scored a point. "No matter whose work it was, it failed to kill the god," Brigadier La'ari dismissed. Now every shard is going to become patron to a different tribe, and that entire island is going to become a clusterfuck of bloodletting for a decade. A clusterfuck we will need to wade into, I'll remind you, because reports made it clear that the red eye made it down to the seabed. We can't let that thing reform and grow any further. Oh, Nare grinned. Is Nani angry because her friend Commander Ardle is going to have to stay and do his job instead of getting a nice cushy promotion? She made a soulful look with the small boy's doe eyes. That's nepotism, Grandma, Nare solemnly said, wagging her finger. Very bad. Brigadier La'ari's face reddened and the flash of rage in her eyes was entirely unfeigned. The Academy's prominence and occasional bouts of arrogance made it unspoken tradition for the other Covenants to join hands and knock them down a peg whenever the occasion arose, but not even that was enough for Ocean to find himself rooting for the Name-Eater. He was not alone in this. Disrupting the proceedings is reason enough to be barred from the room, Captain Falade said. I will not warn you again, Officer Nare. The monster nodded, pouting as she clutched her two large clothes to her scrawny chest. Professor Fenhu cleared their throat. Let us proceed onward, then. Which brings us to your niece, Captain Ocean, Lord Asher said. She makes an interesting case. Ocean straightened his back. Interesting was never a word pleasant to hear coming from a mask's mouth. I have not read the full reports, he carefully said, but what I got my hands on seems a glowing recommendation. If you try to rob my colleagues out of an 18-year-old mirror dancer, Asher, there is going to be a veritable shit show to deal with, Captain Falade warned him. After that report from the Cabal in Kentucky there was already a fit about the Stripes getting the sickle boy, we won't get cheated twice on a single draw. Brigadier La'ari looked faintly smug. I do not doubt her value, Lord Asher dismissed, but I do find it concerning that her contract appears to be with a second-order entity. Peretta is full of things best left buried. Ocean's jaw clenched. He knew not the nature of Angie's contract, but the whole thing reeked of Gwydion. Rhiannon had been much too taken with the triumph of winning the darling of the season to ever dig into her husband's past, but Ocean had always found him suspect. A young man from a fallen house that was barely peers suddenly becoming the flower of Perdiri society when he made his debut? No, Gwydion had been wildly suspicious even before Rhiannon's enemies began having a rash of mysterious accidents all involving spirits. If the man's meddling hurt his daughter from beyond the grave, Ocean was going to get his hands on the body just to feed it to stray dogs. Thankfully, he had anticipated that the Cryptia would dig and stack the game well in advance. There has been no conclusive proof it's a genuine god of the old knight she contracted with, Professor Fenhua mildly said. More likely it is some ancient oracular river god that was missed during the High Queen's purges. It took effort for Ocean not to do the intellectual equivalent of pretending he could not see something right in front of him when the purges were mentioned, the trained reflex still there after all those years. It was not acknowledged that such purges had ever happened, in Malin. Or that it might be in any way unusual that the High Queen had ruled for over 5 centuries. Lord Asher shrugged. Absence of proof is not proof of absence, he said. All worries could be put to rest by allowing the Cryptia to— No, Ocean burst out. All eyes went on him. He licked his lips, ignoring Nare beaming up his way with a childish grin. I mean, he said more calmly, that as Angharate Tredegar's personal sponsor, I do not consent to interrogation by the Cryptia. As if he would let the masks anywhere near her. Knives were the least of what their interrogators had in store. That settles the matter, as far as I am concerned, Captain Falade mildly said. Professor Fenhua? It is my professional opinion that Angharate Tredegar's reported contact with the Red Eye is highly unlikely to have resulted in contamination even if she is truly contracted with a second-order entity, the willowy beauty replied. I have no objections to her candidature. With a senior signifier and peeling professor coming down on his niece's side, there was no one left in the room with the professional standing to argue further. Lord Asher's brow furrowed, but the devil said nothing more. I have concerns as well, Brigadier La'ari announced, drumming her fingers against the desk. Not about the girl's contract, but of the potential trouble that Captain Tredegar brought to our door on her behalf. The Perdiri did not grimace. He had been forewarned this would likely be brought up during the review. "I am willing to answer any question, Brigadier," he evenly replied. The older Someshwari hummed. "You're a senior officer but not all that highly ranked in the Amuthi society," she said. "Yet you have disbursed the sum that is around." She glanced down at a paper, then let out a low whistle. "Well, around the budget for our entire Dominion operation for a year," Lahari said. "Where is the coin coming from, Tredegar?" "That seems an unnecessary intrusion," Professor Fenhu said. "Surely there is," sustained Lord Asher cut in. Captain Falade said nothing, leaving Ocean to sigh. "As some of you may know," he said, "the Clockwork Cathedral allows its members to register inventions with them, giving all rights over the watch in exchange for a flat portion of revenues in perpetuity. 1 100th, which could mean either a pittance or a king's ransom depending on what was registered." "What did you invent?" Lahari asked, sounding interested. To say Ocean had invented the rifle would be untrue, for there were already some in the republics and allegedly in the northern Someshwar, but he had invented the Isabanqua pattern rifle, which was accurate nearly a third further than the Tianxi attempts and could be made at half the price. Most importantly, the casting process required only a few tool changes from the current watch musket workshops. That would save the order millions over the next decades, something he would not gain coin from but had earned him many an indulgence from the Wednesday Council. Unfortunately, his rifles were not yet being made on any large scale. The first workshop had only just been refitted last month. "A weapon, but it is only registered and not yet in service," Ocean admitted. "I borrowed from the watch on future revenues." "Huh?" Captain Falade said, sounding amused. "How far ahead?" No one came to his defense this time, not even Fenhua. They looked as curious as the rest. "By the cathedral's estimates, I have borrowed the next 83 years of revenue," Ocean said, coughing into his fist embarrassedly. All 4 of them were veterans, so the only indication of surprise was Fenhua's lips slightly twitching. "Well," Brigadier Lahari grunted, "if you were splashing that much gold around, it explains the mess in Ixta. I won't weep over the cutters cutting each other, but I was given to understand you nearly caused a major diplomatic incident in Sacramento." Ocean's jaw set maliciously. "I only paid for retaliation on whoever was targeting my niece," he said. "I did not give instructions to." "A mansion belonging to a house of the 6 was torched, Tredegar," Lahari flatly interrupted. "The coin was tracked back to one of our pay houses in the city and Hal Salavera lodged a formal complaint with the conclave. If the Infanzones wanted to play the hirelings," Ocean disdainfully thought, "they should not complain of being treated as such. Besides, their hands were hardly clean. After the incident, in a fit of spite the Salavera had ordered all their contacts in the Guardia to join in the hunt on Angharade. It was half the reason Ocean had done more than pretend to obey when Professor Akia had told him to pull the contract and steer his niece towards Shola Mance instead. I was not aware that we now answered to Sacramento Ewu trash, Professor Fenhu sneered. Maybe not in your libraries, but some of us live in the real Vesper, Brigadier Lahari flatly replied. We import more than half the food for our Trebian holdings through Sacramento, Fenhua. We don't poke at the 6 without a good reason. Our order has a long history of taking in lost souls with nowhere else to go. Lord Asher smiled, never quite showing his teeth. I do not believe you want this to change, and you, so what is it that you are proposing? That we don't rub their face in the girl joining the Black any more than we need to, Brigadier Lahari said. Let the offense die down some by sending her cabal somewhere quiet and out of sight for its first test. We can take the temperature before their second year, see if the storm has passed. There is some sense in that, Captain Falade conceded, pawing at a stack of papers and ripping out a sheet with a noise of satisfaction. And here, the Asphodel Rectorate requested for us to find their latest cult. It seems a fitting assignment. Ocean's brows raised in alarm at the suggestion. Rooting out a hollow cult was supposed to be a quiet assignment? Professor Fenhua noticed his expression and let out a snort. Bard Noble is playing cultist, not a true cult, Fenhua assured him. Last time we caught them they were dealing with some fertility god for party favors. There's not much trouble to be found in Asphodel. Captain Ocean. An acceptable compromise, Lord Asher mused. Under this constraint, I vote to maintain Angharad Tredegar's candidature for Sholomance. The other three agreed, one after the other, and like that it was done. It would be all right, Ocean told himself. He had been to the Rectorate once or twice, if barely beyond the port, and it was a faded power. A backwater past its prime, more concerned by its petty squabbles with other third-raters than its own diminished standing. As quiet as it got in Trebian Sea. How much trouble could one really get in somewhere like the Asphodel Rectorate? Chapter 1. Tristan woke to the gentle rocking of the ship. It was dark inside the cabin, his bedding pulled tight around his body in deference to the coolness of sea winds. The thief's eyes stayed closed even as he pricked his ear, every groan of the old galleon keeping him on edge. It sounded like someone walking on an old floor. Though the Fair Vistas was large enough, he had been given his own cabin and it had a lock on the door. Tristan had spent a great deal of his life picking locks. They were not any real indication of safety. Not that he had solid reason to fear for his, as an inducted watchman on the watch ship headed for a watch school. There was just something about the almost silence in the dark of the cabin and that sound was not just creaking wood. Movement, Tristan thought as his eyes flew open and he threw himself out of the bed. A knife hit the headboard with a sharp thud, half an inch from his face, and as he threw his bedding at the attacker, the thief reached for the knife under his pillow. It wasn't there. Shit. Tristan ripped out the knife in the headboard just in time to get kicked in the stomach. He staggered back, striking blindly, and heard a snort as his wrist was caught. He moved with it, but it was twisted behind his back. He kneed his attacker in the side, but they ignored the blow and kicked his footing down from under him. Dropping to the floor, he rolled and covered his ribs from another kick before cutting at the side of their leg. It drew blood, going through a thin layer of cloth, but his triumph ended when the heel was placed on his throat. When they didn't immediately push in his pharynx and kill him, he realized something was wrong, not that he had time to spare for thought. Pushing away that foot and headbutting between the opponent's legs. A woman, he learned from both what he hit and the faint grunt of pain before he got kneed in the face and rocked back. Scrambling away, he rose to his feet and his leg gave. His limbs were trembling, like he'd been. Contact poison on the knife's grip, Abuela said. That was your first mistake. Well, that explained why Fortuna hadn't woken him up. She avoided Abuela like the plague. Oh, Tristan eloquently replied, flopping to the ground. His limbs were in open rebellion, the louts, and his face was most definitely going to bruise. Which? He got out. Shellfish toxin, my own recipe, she said. You will be fine in an hour. Save for the bout of diarrhea, which we shall call the price of getting sloppy. Tristan let out a whimper. The runs, really? There was no privacy on a ship, everyone would hear. The humiliating punishment would have been confirmation of who he was facing even if he couldn't more or less make her out in the dark. Even absent a lantern he glimpsed the silhouette of her as she sat on the edge of his bed. Abuela was rather short, 5 feet and change, but her impressive mane of snow-white hair made her seem taller. The mid-length wavy bob looked almost regal. Sharp, red cheekbones with cheeks pulling tight and a jutting chin finished the distilled look of a Sacramonte family matriarch, which her stern maroon eyes helped sell. Abuela looked frail, all wrinkled skin and bones, until she kicked you in the stomach and it felt like you'd been hit by a cart. Now, she said. What was your second mistake? The thief forced himself to think even as his limbs twitched uselessly, lying on his side and looking up at his teacher. The dosage must have been very precise for the toxin to weaken his limbs but leave his tongue just fine. I should have cried out for help, he realized after a heartbeat. Yes, Abuela agreed. You are of the watch now. You need to learn to use that, to shake off the habits of the merc. He'd not even thought about it. Back home calling for help was a gamble at best, and when you were a thief the odds that the reinforcements would be on your side made it the kind of gamble only the Lady of Long Odds cared for. Tristan slowly nodded. The others, Miriam and Tredegar and Evensong, would have come to his aid had they heard. He knew that, intellectually. But it was not yet an instinct. You always said not to grow roots, he said. He shied away from outright asking. He had not done well enough in her test to earn the right to ask whatever he wanted. He'd be taking whatever she cared to throw his way, nothing more. The others will be taught by their covenants that a cabal is a sacred thing, Abuela told him. Camaraderie beyond law and reason. It is not. She leaned forward. You do not have the luxury of that lie, the old woman said. You are to be a mask, Tristan de Brascal. A creature of angles and lies, necessity's bastard son. The Cryptia is despised by the other covenants because we are, in truth, as much a check on them as we are on the Watch's enemies. He could not quite see it, but he felt Abuela's smile. Care for them, if you like, she said. But do not ever forget that should they betray the Watch, it is you that will be called on to put poison in their morning tea. And part of him rebelled at that, not even at the killing but the unfairness of it, that everyone else might get a home while he would only ever have a room, but another part accepted it without batting an eye. Of course it would be that way. All his life Abuela had taught him to use the crowd without being part of it. This was just but an extension to an old lesson. She was not the kind of woman whose teachings made exceptions, not even the Watch got a pass. There was a sharp comfort to that, a knife-like relief. Some things did not change. Your performance tonight was only middling, Abuela continued, but I did promise you answers before sending you down the path to the Dominion. You may ask. Tristan swallowed, 100 curiosities crowding his throat until it felt fit to burst. He must pick carefully, he told himself, for she would not be patient forever. Something important, a useful secret. And yet what ripped itself past his lips was anything but. You trained me for this, he said. All this time, you meant me for the Watch. Yes, Abuela simply replied. Why? Why put a knife to the whetstone, a till to the land? She asked. Because that is their purpose and nature. When I found you, Tristan, our hunt was already carved into your bones. Now you will chase them with skill as well as hatred, that is all I changed. His jaw clenched. It had the ring of truth to it. Shalomance, he pressed. There are other ways to join the Watch, or even that school. Why send me to the Dominion of Lost Things? You could have been enrolled on my word alone, Abuela casually admitted, but you would have lost your chance at Cosmoflor. A name on your little list, yes? Yes, Tristan hissed. It had been weeks yet he still savored the memory of his knife cutting that throat like the finest of meals. The Cheriton brothers had only been interested on an old debt. Cosmoflor, he'd been the fifth of a balance in need of settling. And what did you learn from him? Abuela asked. It is still Lord Laurent that runs their house of horrors, Tristan said. It's out in the Trebian Sea somewhere but the staff may have changed. Professor Charette is being used as a children's tutor, of all things. He grit his teeth. And I know the god, now, he said. Cosm called it the almsgiver. A thoughtful pause. Not a name known to me, Abuela said. A sobriquet, I imagine, as it would have been foolish to use its real name. Still, that is useful information. You did well. And it fell into place, just like that. You used me to get at them, Tristan said. In a way that can't be traced even if the Cheriton have people on the Watch. It wasn't just about me, it was about what I could get for the Cryptia. And you got us her name, dear, the old woman smiled. You did not disappoint. And Lieutenant Vicente, was she another bird to catch with your one stone? He coldly asked. She hated me from the moment she knew you've taught me, Nere. His eyes narrowed. If that is even your name. Abuela considered him for a long moment. It is not the one I was born to, she told him. Yet it is the one I have kept the longest and which I prefer, as it was earned and not given. She called you an abomination, Tristan challenged. She laughed, sounding almost pleased. I am the last of the 50 servants of the changing king, eater of his name, Abuela replied. For this man came to call me Nere name eater, crowning me heresiarch. One day you will learn the meaning of that word, Tristan, and understand that fear is the least of what it deserves. And though he knew not why the whisper of the syllables in the air, heresiarch, king and heresy, sent a shiver down his spine. It was as if the word itself were a dreadful thing, poisonous to the touch. Vicente Calanus sought to unearth things best left buried and was thrice chided for it, twice by myself, once by one of your fellow students, Abuela idly continued. She took poorly to the lesson. You didn't answer my question, Tristan quietly said. Did you set me up to kill her for you? Abuela smiled. What do you think? I think you'd say you left it up to chance, the thief said. But you know how I am and you know how she was, so chance was never part of it. I cleaned up your loose end for you. You did not take her life yourself, Abuela said. Neither did you, he said. But that's now how you taught me to do it because it's not how masks work, is it? I did you a favor. That means you owe me. Bold, she said, but did not deny him. And what would you use a favor on? He grimaced. There's a man in Sacramonte, he said. He was married to one of the trial takers, Pietro Ragon, she said. The general killer's wayward husband. Run off with Hoyoroya money, I believe. He was not even surprised she knew. Gods, Abuela even knew more than he did. He had not known the surname of Young's husband or even that he had one. Yes, Tristan said. Young was in a red game, under terms that if he got to the third trial they would write off the loan and spare him. He did get there, but... You want me to make sure, Abuela said. And to tell him about what Young did, he said. I will myself, one day, but I understand I might not be able to return to Sacramonte for some time. It is a wasted favor, she told him. The coteries scrupulously observe all the terms of the red games. Tristan frowned. It's the Hoyoroya, he skeptically said. They'd cheat their own mothers for drinking money. True, Abuela said. And yet I did not lie. Ah, a riddle lesson. A puzzle whose pieces he must find and put together by asking the right questions. The red games themselves are nonsense, the thief said. Yet plenty of the largest coteries do them. What is it they get out of it? It is gambling, Abuela said. A senseless kind, Tristan pointed out. It is expensive to buy seats and they do not even see the deaths. Paying a fortune for reports seems like a poor game. Why not have their indebted fight to death in a pit, if that is their itch? Why indeed, Abuela said. He cocked his head aside. He'd been looking at it the wrong way by wondering why the Roya would suddenly grow a conscience. They had not. It was simply that the choice was not theirs to make. They are not gambling with each other, he said. There's a god involved. Abuela smiled. The coteries bet on the manners of death, the old woman said, and if they predicted correctly they earn boons from their patron. He blinked. That is ritual sacrifice, or close enough, he slowly said. Forbidden by the Iscariot Accords. The deaths happen on watch grounds, under watch auspices, Abuela said. It is a narrow line, but they walk it, as they have for over a century now. And the watch let it happen, Tristan thought, so there would be more deaths to feed the gods they used to keep the red more contained. Red games, red fates and red hands all around. Gods, but it was an ugly business. But Mariam had broken the machine and that should put an end to it. There was no more seal to strengthen, no need left for an altar. That was something. So Pietro Ragon is safe because if they welch on the terms of the bet the god will get angry with the coteries, the thief mused. That only means the debt is written off, though. The man might still be in trouble. Minor troubles, Abuela said. Worth using a favor on. Tristan sighed. Yes, he regretfully. Please tidy it up for me. To his surprise, the old woman looked approving. Tying off all your loose ends properly is the mark of professional, she said. A sensible decision, worth the reward of a warning. He swallowed. I'm listening, Tristan said. You are a wanted man, Abuela said. A price has been placed on your head, taken alive. He did not hide his surprise. The Cherden? He asked. They should not know of him, at least not enough to put coin on his death. His killing of Raymond Cherden was still a secret to all but Mariam and a dead woman. No, Abuela said. It is from inside the watch, someone with connections. Shalomance will not be safe. Students are allowed to fight each other. He'd thought the trials of the Dominion an outlier, not the rule. Yes. Not to kill, but much anything short of that, the old woman said. Abducting and selling you would not be against the rules, strictly speaking. He would have rubbed the bridge of his nose if he could. They'd not even docked at the bloody island and already other students headed out for him. I don't suppose there is anything you could do? He tried. Do not worry of any hands but that of other students, Abuela said. That is what I have done. He slowly nodded his thanks. She was running interference with whoever was behind this, then, but could no more dip her finger into Sholoman's affairs than his mysterious enemy could. It was not a pleasing compromise, but he would live with it. Would have to. Abuela leaned forward, patting his shoulder. One last word of advice, she said. Do not wait for plaques to be forged. Take whatever they have on hand. Though he had no notion of what a plaque would be, Tristan filed the advice away. If she had bothered to give it out, it was worth eating. Still, the mysteriousness was worth a dig. Cryptic, he said, rather proud at the double meaning. Even in the dark, he could feel the unimpressed look he was being fixed with. That hasn't been funny in at least a century, Abuela sighed. Tristan would have made a rude gesture back, but his limbs were still flopping about. He really must ask her for that recipe next time they met. He could think of all sorts of uses for it. The old woman rose to her feet, brushing off a piece of lint from the loose shirt she was wearing. Those are the same shirts and trousers most the sailors are wearing, he noted. It only occurred to him then that the Fair Vistas was days away from any land and had not slowed enough for another ship to dock. Have you been on the ship the whole time? Tristan asked. Have I? Abuela mused. I wonder. You might learn if you saw me leave. The thief glanced at his useless limbs and sighed. Can you tell me where my knife is, at least? Yes, the old woman agreed. He was unsurprised when she walked away without another word, unlatching his lock and quietly closing the door behind her. Tristan rolled onto his back, wiggling his ass to find if he might be able to sit, but instead landing with his cheek pressed to the floor. For a proper prostration you're supposed to be on your knees with your hands past your head, Fortuna said. Still, I'll give you points for trying. Thank you for the help, as always, he sarcastically said. Would it have killed you to give me a heads up before running for it? I didn't run for it, the lady of long odds lied. I was just busy with other things. Funny how you're always busy when she comes to visit, Tristan said. Coincidence, Fortuna dismissed. He rolled again, looking up and finding Fortuna seated atop the trunk holding his affairs. She had changed the style of her dress again, though still blood red. It now bore a high collar and a pale mantle before descending into puffy sleeves. The skirts were more closely cut, still hiding away her feet but no longer trailing behind. She had gone heavier than usual on jewelry, too. The loose belt around her waist was a golden rope set with red jasper, and over her mantle she wore a gold choker alternating rubies and pearls. Your mood has turned, he noted. Are you that afraid of her god? He did not for certain Abuela had a contract, but had always assumed. It was either that or she was half ghost, able to appear and disappear at will. Fortuna glared at him. I fear nothing, his goddess insisted. She is discordant, Tristan. It is. Imagine the worst sound you know, made into a song. Discordant, the thief repeated. As opposed to harmonious? The word she used to mean becoming a saint. Fortuna looked away without answering, which was as good as a confirmation. What was the opposite of sainthood, then? Maybe having a soul so hostile to divinity it hurt gods to be in its presence. Tristan itched to know what a heresiarch was, but it seemed like the kind of question that was dangerous to ask. He would have to be careful, gauge the dangers and put a scholar in his debt. I am starting to look forward to Sholomance, Tristan mused. It seems a place full of opportunities. And enemies, but where was that not true? The thief's stomach gurgled ominously. Ah, the side effects of the shellfish toxin Abuela had warned him about. Tristan tried to move his hands and got some of his fingers to twitch. Now he would get to find out which came first, working limbs or the runs. Breakfast on the Fair Vistas was odd. The galleon was the largest ship Tristan had ever been on, but Captain Crack, don't try to joke, the first mate had warned them, She's heard them all and she's got a temper, had arranged matters so they got to eat between sailors' shifts. The four of them were usually alone in the common room, a strange feeling in the ship that felt crowded even when running on a skeleton crew. The morning cook was an old Sacramentan bastard missing an eye and most of his teeth, which he'd had replaced with obviously fake silver. He and Tristan had taken to each other instantly, smelling the rat on the other, and as a consequence the old man simply cocked an eyebrow instead of asking about his black eye or nightly affliction. Tristan trudged out with his plate and mug, nodding his thanks, only to immediately be ambushed by his own crew. "Did you somehow lose a fight with your bed frame?" Mariam asked, lips twitching. He glared half-heartedly at the Triglav. Having shed any pretense of disguise, like Sung, the pale-skinned woman was now entirely in watch blacks. A collared tunic with silvered buttons that went down past her knees, black breeches tucked into tall leather boots. With a dark headband to keep back her bangs, she looked very much like the Blastloak she had been since they first met. She also sounded amused, because Tristan was cursed to be surrounded by women who took delight in his pain. He sometimes suspected he might have crossed some great god of femininity in a previous spin of the circle. "I was visited last night," the thief grunted back, setting down his plate. He claimed the empty spot by Song, facing Mariam and Tredegar, who only offered him a nod, tearing into her meal with polite gusto. To his continuing bemusement, the noblewoman seemed to enjoy ship fare. More than him anyway. He was used to the fish and cheese, but he could have done without the ale. Unfortunately, Captain Crack had rationed drinking water until the next rain, so he was left to drink that fermented swill regardless of preference. "By the runs, I hear," Sung drawled. "Apparently the crew though you were getting attacked." Sung wore much the same as Mariam, though unlike the Triglav she wore the accompanying black cloak even when inside. By the looks of it she'd freshly remade that long braid going down her back. "Was it the tipped biscuits?" Tredegar asked, sounding sympathetic. "I saw some the crew offering you some, but that is risky business. My mother always said you should never eat shipboard food you haven't seen the cook nibble at." In truth that seemed rather sound advice, like most of the advice Angharad Tredegar attributed to her mother. Some kind of famous Milani explorer, he'd been told. But Susanna Marrere rang no bell. A month ago he would have thought Tredegar's concern a false one, perhaps a verbal knife being twisted, but Tristan had learned better. The noblewoman was painfully earnest, which somehow made this worse. It was a little early for a man to be besieged on all sides in such a manner, but Tristan had long known that life was full of injustices. "I did get attacked," Tristan said, gathering together the last shreds of his pride. "Abuela came in the night, beat and poisoned me, then left behind some crumbs of information." Angharad Tredegar straightened on the bench, eyes hardening. "We are guests on this ship, under the protection of the watch," she said. "To attack you is, I appreciate the concern," Tristan cut in, surprised to realize he mostly meant it, "but it has always been this way with her. She is a hard teacher but not unfair." "Ah, a lesson?" the dark-skinned woman nodded. "I understand." The thief squinted at her. Usually people disbelieved him when he mentioned Abuela's methods. One orthodoxy priest had thought she was a pimp beating him, something Fortuna hadn't let go for months, so he had to admit some mild concern over Tredegar's absence of concern. Mind you, her parents had tried to feed the perduree to a monster once a year since she was 8, so her standards might be skewed a tad. Mariam leaned across the table, frowning at him, and slowly came to rest a finger on the bridge of his nose. He went cross-eyed trying to look at what she was doing until she withdrew her finger. "You're not emanating any different than the other," she said. "You shouldn't be cursed. That I can tell, at least, it isn't my specialty. And while I'd like to make fun of you for getting beaten up by yet another crone, I'm rather stuck on the detail that this abuela of yours apparently showed up on our ship in the middle of the sea." Tristan shrugged. "It's abuela," he said. "That's not an explanation," Mariam informed him. "Give it a few years," Tristan honestly replied, "and it will be." It had been something of a shock as a boy to realize that the sweet old lady that had obviously gotten lost in the murk and needed to be warned off the Menromano boys, out to rob her and sell her off to a trenched crew, had never been in any danger at all. She had, if anything, been the danger. Song cleared her throat. "You mentioned information?" she asked. "This isn't over," Mariam mouthed to him from across the table. Quoth Billy Tang, the thief mouthed back, "Nonsense, just legible enough she'd think she had failed to read his lips right." Song was cocking an eyebrow at him by the time he looked to her again. "Apparently there is a price on my head," he said. "Some people might be after me at Sholomance." A pause. "As a prisoner," he clarified. "Not a corpse." "Already?" Mariam mused, chewing her cheese. "That's probably some sort of record, Tristan. Our cabal is already breaking fresh grounds." "Take this seriously, Mariam," Song said, tone gone flat. Tredegar looked unmoved at the thought of further enemies, but Song was openly irritated. Tristan and the Tianxi did not get along particularly well. That the noble on their crew would be easier to deal with than the Republican had been a most unwelcome surprise, though he'd concede her dislike did not color how she treated him. She was a professional, which he could respect. "Difficulties mount," Song sighed. "Tristan, kindly investigate the matter after we dock so that we might decide how it would best be resolved." "That was already my intention," Tristan shrugged. Best to go to his would-be abductors before they went to him, as choosing the grounds was a lot likelier not to end in him with shackled in some ship's belly. "I've also been advised to take whatever plaques are on hand instead of waiting for new ones to be forged," he said. "Though I'm not sure what it means." Mariam's face gave no hint as to her thoughts, and Tredegar was politely attentive, which had yet to stop being unsettling. It was Song who had answers. "When our cabal is registered on the school rolls, we will be granted funding and identification plaques to access it," she said. "I only know so much of Sholomance, so I cannot tell you more." Tristan hummed. "How do you know so much of Sholomance, anyway?" he asked. Mariam does not seem to. He flicked a glance at the pale-skinned woman, who shrugged. "I don't," she said. "The navigator that recommended me hasn't been this far south in years, and before I was offered a candidature I lived on one of the guild's island outposts. Not the sort of place where juicy gossip gets traded." Mariam was not, of course, a member of the Epilogue Guild. Like Song, she was a member of the rank and file of the garrison, though Mariam had been recruited by a navigator and only ever stayed in outposts under the authority of the Epilogue Guild. They had clearly been grooming her for the Covenant before offering her the shortcut of joining by graduating from Sholomance. "Much like all of you, I have a connection in the Watch," Song admitted. "My great-aunt's widower, a member of the Academy. He is the one who recommended me." "And he's got something to do with Sholomance?" Tristan pressed. "He is of sufficient rank to know some things, but only so much. The school is some kind of private fiefdom within the Watch," the Tianxi said. "My uncle mentioned meeting me in Sholomance as soon as he can," Tredegar said. "I could ask him about this." "Ah, yes, the famous Uncle Ocean. He had the apparently unlimited funds and jolly bribery." Tristan thought it more than passing odd the Perduri officer would be willing to sink a fortune in helping a niece he'd apparently only met twice, but that might be the orphan in him talking. "If we are to register it will probably be the same day we dock," Tristan said. "Unless he's already there and waiting for you, we'll have to make the decision blind." Tredegar acknowledged the reply with a nod. "It would be foolish to dismiss a warning from a high-ranking member of the Masks," Song noted. "Let us heed it if we can." "We could ask Feranda and the others if they know anything," Mariam suggested. "They should be getting there about a week before we do." Mostly bad luck on their part, that. While Lady Feranda Vilazar had accepted the offer of being recommended for Sholomance by the Academy, she had been told that the best way to have the formalities finished in time was passing through the rookery. As a consequence, while Feranda and the two she intended to make a cabal with, Shalini Gol and Lord Zenzel Duma, had departed on the Bluebell days ahead of the Fair Vista's expected arrival, the four of them should have arrived at Sholomance long before the others did. Only the Fair Vistas had been a week and a half late, a third of her crew missing when she docked at Three Pines. They'd run into a gloom storm, of all the bad luck. If they'd not had a skilled navigator with them, the storm would have likely taken every soul on board. There was a reason Tristan and the others had all gotten individual cabins instead of being made to share. I approve of reaching out in principle, Sung said, but it might be difficult to find them in practice. The number of students attending should be slightly above 400. Tristan let out a low whistle. That is a lot of dangerous people, he said. Maybe some of those who'd got in through connections would be softer, but anyone making cut for shalomance was bound to have an edge to them. The school itself might be as dangerous as the competition, the Tianxi said. We must be very careful when we arrive. Already our situations come with enemies, we cannot afford to make fresh ones. Tredegar cleared her throat, which earned her a fondly raised eyebrow from Song. Yes? Then we should remember that Tupac will have had weeks there to dragoon some followers, she said. He will no longer be alone. Tupac Sickle had left the day before the Blue Belt, that was true. The Aztlan had gotten in good with the Cabal during the battle for Kentika, and one of the members had insisted that Tupac get to sail with them. They are supposed to go through the rookery as well, Tristan pointed out. He might get there at the same time as Firanda's lot, but not much earlier. Certainly not weeks. Tredegar shook her head. To his surprise, so did Mariam. Did you not have a look at their ship's hull? The Perduri asked. Tristan shook his head. He had stayed away from the docks in Three Pines, wary of attracting the attention of the Cabal before it departed. If one of them was a mask, they might get curious about the odd details surrounding Cosm's death. It was metal, Song provided. I have seen others like it before, though rarely in only flying watch flags. They are atomic ships, Tredegar said. That is to say, the hull is made of atomic alloy. You might know such ships better by the name of skimmers. The thief blinked. He had heard that name before. As in the magic ships that never lose their way and can fly. He skeptically said. They cannot actually fly, the noblewoman said, sounding faintly disappointed. But the metal is an antediluvian alloy with strange properties that cut through gloom and ether. They skim on the surface, thus the name. That's only mostly true, Mariam noted. She got a hard look from Tredegar at the phrasing for that, innocently smiling back. Those two were taking to each other worse than he and Song, and he was not even sure he could entirely blame the noblewoman for it. When she angered Mariam, it was usually by accident. Mariam was most definitely doing it on purpose. You can have an atomic ship that's not a skimmer, the blue-eyed woman continued. Most aren't. There are some that don't even make the entire hull with alloy, just the keel. It's why you can get rich raiding First Empire ruins and finding no artifacts. Even a door frame made of atomic alloy will be worth a fortune if you strip it out and sell it. Interesting, he had never heard of that around the docks, but then that kind of trade would have been a little rich for his blood. The ship in port was one of those? Tristan asked. Mariam nodded. It just had the metal hull, she said. Mind you, it's still quicker than anything made out of wood. Except Malani ironwood, Tredegar mildly added. She sounded rather satisfied she could correct Mariam in turn. The Triglar rolled her eyes. Except the magic wood Malani sold to no one, yes, Mariam agreed. For a ship to be a skimmer, however, it needs not only atomic hull but an etheric engine. That is much rarer, and even though they surpass everything else in service, no one makes skimmers anymore. Are the engines truly that difficult to make? Sung asked, sounding surprised. How Tianxi of her, Tristan thought amusedly. Like it was no trouble to make even shoddy copies of antediluvian wonders. Half the six were on top of the infants in pecking order, mostly because they'd got their hand on some First Empire treasure and could work it well enough. I can only guess, but I would say it's about coin, Mariam said. The etheric engines we can make are nowhere as good as those inherited from the First or even Second Empire, so the largest ships we can make are still smaller than caravels. Tristan was no sailor, but he had worked around the quay long enough to learn a thing or two about trade ships. Caravels were known to be sleek, quick and needed only a small crew, but they were a rare sight in the Trebian Sea because a caravel also could not carry much cargo. Hulks, Caravels and galleons were a lot more profitable to run unless your goods were small and needed to be moved quickly. Caravels were mostly Millennium and Romayan ships, meant for exploration across dark and distant seas. So the skimmers we can make are expensive, too small for war and too expensive risk on exploration, Tristan summed up. They also need a dedicated shipyard on special grounds, and the materials for the engine are almost as rare and expensive as atomic alloys, Mariam said. The great powers probably can afford to build some skimmers, but for what? The old ones keep well, so most nations have legacy ships still in service that make anything they could build look like children's toys. The republics might buy them, Song noted. Most of the fleet from the times of the Kingdom of Cathay has been sunk or stolen. No one will sell the Republic's ships, Tredegar said, not unkindly. Tianxi are already very quarrelsome at sea, no other power would want to strengthen their position. Tristan choked. That was more than slightly amusing coming from a Perduri, of all things. The Kingdom of Malin was infamous not only for producing more pirates than all the other great powers put together, but also for its tendency to anchor war fleets just out of bombardment distance of whatever small nation they wanted to establish trade with. It was an old sailor's joke that any land discovered by the High Queen's ships would soon have to take either her gold or her lead. Tianxia has been involved in many quarrels at sea, I am sure, Song calmly replied, a delicate rebuke. Regardless, we have strayed from our original conversation. I take it your point is that on such a ship Tupac will arrive long ahead of us, or Fear and his crew for that matter? Tredegar nodded. He will make a cabal, or take one, the Perduri said. We should be prepared to face him. He is a stripe, so the only one of us who should share classes with him is Song, Tristan said. The Tianxi shook her head. Only about half the lessons will be handled by our covenants, she said. There will be general classes as well, where we might run into him. Which meant they would, because Tupac would not be able to resist poking at his old friends from the Dominion. I'm told we're not allowed to kill other Sholoman students, Tristan said. But also that not much short of that is disallowed. Tredegar perked up, gaze turning to Song. If I cut all his limbs off, do you think they would grow back? The thief quietly swallowed, mouth gone dry. The tone was hopeful, like a little boy who thought he might get lamb for supper. Like she was not casually speaking of chopping off a man's arms and legs. Gods, every time he thought he was getting used to her. Perhaps we might try diplomacy first, Song mildly replied. Either way, unlike Fear and his crew, he is best avoided if we can. I expect he will find his fellow students have much less patience for his antics than circumstance forced us to keep back on the Dominion. Tristan hummed. We are going around in circles, he said. There's no point in making a plan if we do not know the lay of the land we're headed into. That is not untrue, Song reluctantly conceded. It will not be too late to decide once we get to Sholomance, Tredegar said. She rose from the bench, picking up the plate she had emptied before anyone else at the table. I was promised a spar by one of the officers I do not want to be late for, she informed them. If you will forgive me, I must take my leave. I might as well accompany you, Song said. I finished the book Captain Crack lent me, I should return it before asking for another. He and Marian waved them off, their own meals still unfinished. After they had left to return their plates to the cook, leaving the two of them alone, he cocked an eyebrow at his friend. You know much of skimmers, he leadingly said. A navigator is needed to run them properly, Mariam replied, a little too casually. Preferably a tinker from the other branch as well, but always an killer guildsman. He said nothing, only biting into his salted fish. And I might have a personal interest in them, she admitted. The gray-eyed thief cocked his head to the side. May I ask why? Mariam considered him a long moment, then sighed. There's somewhere I need to go, she said. And it is, I think, the only kind of ship that could get me there. This place of yours, dangerous? He idly asked. Very. Secret? There are no maps in existence. And, I assume, forbidden. By both gods and men, she agreed. Sounds, Tristan the Brascal mused, like an interesting place to visit, one of these days. blue eyes on gray. A moment passed, then her shoulders loosened. "Maybe I could be talked into bringing you along," Mariam Kamif smiled. Tope continued, "Thanks for listening.